Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about the rise of the Republican Party and, therefore, the rise of the third party system. We're now up to three. First one, Federalists, Democratic Republicans. Second one, Democrats and Whigs. Third one, Democrats and Republicans. Now, as we've been talking about the past few weeks, the two main parties in the second party system were the Whigs and the Democrats. Two different parties, but in certain ways, the Whigs and the Democrats were more similar than they were different. For despite their differences over such issues as economic development, financial policy, whether there should be a national bank, for example, and the fact that the Democrats were clearly more comfortable with the white man's democracy that emerged during this period, the Democrats and the Whigs fundamentally agreed on the value of economic individualism, the rights of property, and other capitalist virtues. So, there were differences between the parties, but culturally and ideologically speaking, they were not too terribly polarized. Both parties, moreover, had adherents in both the North and the South, which was another dynamic that kept them from becoming too dramatically different. The debates over slavery, however, changed this. With the increasing disagreement over the implications of slavery, the development of two different cultures, fundamentally opposed, that divided along sectional lines, emerged. 2 decades before the Civil War witnessed the development of conflicting sectional ideologies, writes one historian, each viewing its own society as fundamentally well-ordered, and the other as both a negation of its most cherished values and a threat to its existence. End quote. So this is what you end up seeing emerge with the death of the second party system. Now, as for the South, it had the Democratic Party, which had long been tied to the interests of slaveholders, all the way back to its founders, right? Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and others. That is why the Democratic Party, by the eve of the Civil War, had transformed substantial portions of the South into fundamentally one-party regions. Almost everyone voted Democratic in these areas because to do so otherwise was again viewed as putting the institution of slavery and the social hierarchy of white supremacy at risk. However, the issue of slavery did damage the Democratic Party because many Northern Democrats eventually decided they could no longer reside in the same party as the slave power aristocrats. And so for a while, the Democratic Party was split in two. However, while the Democratic Party would eventually survive somewhat intact, the conflicts over slavery killed the Whig Party. When the anti-slavery faction in the Whig Party succeeded in denying their own sitting president, Millard Fillmore, the nomination for a second term in office because of his pro-slavery stance, it became clear that the party no longer had an ideological coherence. Moreover, their primary leaders, Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, who had previously engineered the compromises that kept the party together, well, they both died in 1852, leaving the fledgling party without any effective leadership. So in the wake of the death of the Whig Party, the Republican Party emerged as the party of Northern values and opposition to the expansion of slavery. The Republican Party was successful in part because it crafted an ideology that could hold a lot of people in the same boat. Among the members of the Republican Party were radicals, former Democrats, and moderate and conservative Whigs. Now, real quickly, just to refresh our memories so we can keep track of where we've come and where we're going to, this last party system is the third party system, and here you see a sketch of the previous two party systems when they were existing, and then when you get the emergence of the third party system in the late 1850s. So you might want to screenshot that or something. It's good for studying. Alright, so what was this ideology of the Republican Party about that kept its coalition together? Well, first and foremost, it was about the notion of free labor. First, the Republicans embraced an expansive concept of what counted as labor. A laborer did not just refer to a worker, a wage earned in a factory, for example, but anyone involved in what was considered productive work. So, when Republicans spoke of free labor, they meant farmers, businessmen, small businessmen, independent craftsmen, and workers. Indeed, the ideal was not to be a permanent wage worker, maybe the first thing that comes to mind when you think of labor, because this means you would be dependent on someone else, right? That old lowercase Republican ideology is still there. But the idea was to labor your way to financial independence. Therefore, the ideology of free labor was one that also fundamentally believed in social mobility and embraced the commercialized economy that the development of capitalism had brought, for they believed it offered everyone a chance to labor their way to independence. As Daniel Webster once put it, "Who are the laboring people of the North? They are the whole North. They are the people who till their own farms with their own hands, freeholders, educated men, independent men." Notice there how he is saying they are the people who till their own farms with their own hands. This is clearly a reference to the contrast of the South, the people where the people who do not own the farms are doing the labor on those farms. Secondly, the Republican Party honored this effort of labor as a deeply dignified pursuit. Indeed, the value of labor, they believed, lay at the heart of Northern values, and the value of free labor, they argued, should never be slighted. As one Republican put it, quote, "The great idea and basis of the Republican Party, as I understand it, is free labor. To make labor honorable is the object and aim of the Republican Party." End quote. Moreover, Republicans viewed the interest of labor and the interests of capital as one and the same. As they celebrated the dynamic, constantly changing, and mobile society capitalist development had created, they also sincerely believed that capitalist society offered to all laboring men the chance to themselves one day be the possessors of a sufficient amount of property to have the treasured independence all men wanted. A lot has changed about the Republican Party from its inception to today. Can hardly regard it as the same party in any literal sense, but this, however, has remained consistent. Because they had this faith in the compatibility of the laborers' interests and the capitalist interests, they discouraged attacks on property rights and emphasized the harmony of interests the system of free labor and capitalism produced. As Abraham Lincoln put it, quote, "Let not him who is houseless pull down the house of another, but let him labor diligently and build one for himself, thus by example assuring that his own shall be safe from violence when built." End quote. If, through hard work of dignified labor, a man was unable to rise to the level of independence, that was a result of the failure of his own individual character, Republicans believed. As Lincoln also explained, if a man did not rise out of the condition of a wage laborer, quote, "It is not the fault of the system, but because of either a dependent nature which prefers it, or improvidence, folly, or singular misfortune." End quote. So Lincoln is very clear here, right? It is not the fault of the system. That system more or less being capitalism. So the Republican Party, while embracing labor as its central value, also embraced the notion that we talked about a lot when we were discussing the Second Great Awakening, that the fate of the individual in the economy was entirely in the hands of the individual, and therefore failure reflected their own shortcomings, and it was not a problem with market society. This viewpoint reflected the backgrounds of almost all of the major leaders of the Republican Party. They were solidly middle class, and their assumptions and values were the assumptions and values of men who had been successful in the market and now enjoyed a middle class independence and virtue. So from their perspective, it's obviously true, right, that virtue is met with reward. However, insofar as the Republicans did offer a strategy for decreasing the laboring poor, they argued that expansion westward was the key. The laboring poor, the working poor, they believed, should be encouraged to migrate west, and some said, even be given free land out west to encourage this settlement, something they did indeed enact during the Civil War. This idea was especially popular since offering land to the poor was viewed as not merely a way to reduce the number of dependent laborers, but also as a way of trying to prevent the West from being taken over by slavery. Start to settle it with free and independent white men. You'll get a stronghold, a foot in the door against slavery. As Horace Greeley, the editor of the New York Tribune and one of the founders of the Republican Party, put it, quote, "The public lands are the great regulator of the relations of labor and capital, the safety valve of our industrial and social engine," end quote. So, what he is saying is that whenever the poor start to get too numerous and social relations between the various classes start to get tense, the poor could simply move westward to release the pressure a large concentration of poor or unemployed men and women could cause, allowing class relations to cool and providing an option for the desperate and the poor. Now, the reality of this is an entirely different question, but ideologically speaking, it was one of the primary solutions Republicans offered for dealing with the growth of wage labor. So, if Republicans' vision of a good society was one with equal opportunity and a dynamic economy, their vision of a bad society was one with a stagnant economy and an abundance of dependent men, and vampire-like aristocrats. Republicans, after all, valued social mobility and a large middle class. But in the South, not only were the slaves poor, but also poor whites lived in horrible poverty, while meanwhile a very rich, extravagant minority possessed the vast majority of property and political power. Moreover, the South, compared to the highly developed and industrialized North, seemed hardly to belong in the eyes of Republicans to the modern world. As one Republican who toured Virginia explained, quote, he described it thus: "An exhausted soil, old and decaying towns, wretchedly neglected roads, and in every respect an absence of enterprise and improvement, distinguish the region through which we have come, in contrast to that in which we live. Such has been the effect of slavery." End quote. So clearly, his impression there is not a positive one. He feels like he's in a backwater, bereft of civilization. And slavery had such an impact on the Southern economy, Republicans argued, because it removed the incentive for effort and improvement. Obviously, slaves themselves, let me go back here, sorry about that. Doopity-doo. Obviously, slaves themselves had no incentive at all to try to better themselves and were denied the education, the opportunity to do so. But even worse, non-slaving owning whites were also subject to the most degrading poverty. This is worse in the minds of Republicans, right? Because they're racist, so clearly it's worse for white people to deal with undignified situations. And because hard physical labor was associated with slavery, the labor that was available to them was not honored or respected. The labor that was available to poor white men, that is. One Republican decried, for example, how 3/4 of the South's white population, quote, retired to the outskirts of civilization, where they live a semi-savage life, sinking deeper and more hopelessly into barbarism with every succeeding generation, end quote. Not a happy report there. So what the South fundamentally lacked was a solid middle class. There was no opportunity for hard work and virtue to lift those born with few resources to improve their circumstances. And therefore the South, according to Republicans, was entirely divided between slaves, poor whites, and the grossly wealthy aristocratic class of planters. As one Chicago newspaper opined, quote, fortunes are frequently inherited in the South. They are rarely made, end quote. So, because of slavery, in the Republican mind, the South lacked all the signs of progress of the North, from industrialization and internal improvements to the possibility of social mobility, and therefore, quite apart from any question about the morality of slavery, slavery was a drag on Southern civilization, whether or not it was right or wrong. So, Republicans believed that slavery was an outdated social system that degraded everyone who partook in it, and they also believed that the West offered the best solution to the awkward reality that far more men in the North were in fact dependent on wage laboring than most Republicans wanted to admit. Therefore, the number one issue for the Republican Party was to ensure that slavery did not spread westward. This single goal was what held what could be sometimes a motley coalition of people all together in one party. If you did not desire the prevention of the system of slavery to the new states of the Western territories, you would not join the Republican Party. Republicans believed that the future of the country rested in the West. And they also believed that if slavery sunk its teeth, so to speak, into the new territory in the West, it would be very, very difficult to dislodge. So, there was also a sense of urgency to the issue of slavery in the West. Northerners could not dilly-dally or delay in ensuring that the West would be free, for if they decided to rid the West of slavery after it had already taken root, it would be far too late. As William Seward, Lincoln's future Secretary of State, put it, the people of the Northwest would decide, quote, whether this is to be a land of slavery or of freedom, end quote. As another Republican politician put it while discussing the future of the territory of Nebraska, quote, shall populous, thriving villages and cities spring up all over the face of Nebraska? Or shall unthrift and sparseness, standstill and decay ever characterize that state? Shall unpaid, unwilling toil, inspired by no hope and impelled by no affection, drag its weary, indolent limbs over that state, hurrying the soil to bareness and leaving the wilderness a wilderness still? Are you not bound by the highest considerations of duty to assist in building up the institutions of Nebraska on a substantial and free basis? End quote. If such would be the fate of the West, should it be consumed by slavery, if so, he's just described, right? What would come of the South if it was consumed by slavery. But if the West was free, on the other hand, a very different society would result. One which, as Samuel P. Chase put it, would enjoy, quote, freedom, not serfdom, freeholds, not tenancies, democracy, not despotism, education, not ignorance, progress, not stagnation or retrogression, end quote. So, simply put, the fate of the nation and whether or not it would be a place for free labor, free soil, and free men rested on the fate of the West. And the fate of the West was compelling to so many people because, unlike arguments about the immorality and cruelty of slavery, the fate of the West felt immediate, personally relevant. Northerners anxiously felt that their own chances at either making larger fortunes or building their own independent wealth for the first time relied on the availability of the West to the settlement of a free market and the free labor system of capitalism. As one Republican put it, quote, "We are all personally interested in this question, not indirectly and remotely as in a mere political abstraction, but directly, pecuniarily, and selfishly. If we do not exclude slavery from the territories, it will exclude us." End quote. So it couldn't get any clearer, right, than that. Even if one had no personal need or plans to go west, Republicans argued, Northerners still had an interest in stopping the spread of slavery. For were the Western territories occupied by slavery, the North would become an isolated enclave of free labor, a minority whose ability to protect their version of society would be overwhelmed by the political representatives of slavery. Right? More states that have slavery, more senators and congressmen representing the interests of slavery. Moreover, this was an argument which again appealed to all the different groups that made up the Republican Party, from radical abolitionists to former Northern Democrats who emphasized the importance of land and jobs for free white men, to former Whigs. Indeed, the threat to free labor that the expansion of slavery posed did not even require sympathy for the slaves. Most Republicans believed African Americans to be inferior to white people. In order to assure people that the issue of slavery's expansion was not the same question as racial equality, Republicans would even emphasize this, insisting, as one Republican put it, that most Republicans, quote, had no squeamish sensitiveness upon the subject of slavery, no morbid sympathy for the slave, end quote. So, fierce opposition to the spread of slavery did not require fierce opposition to the owning of human beings as property, and it certainly did not require opposition to racial prejudice. The system of slavery, Republicans argued, eroded the respect for equality amongst white men that was so central to the freedom and prosperity of the North. Because slavery had resulted in the South in an extremely rich minority and a large majority of very poor whites, it encouraged an aristocratic and gluttonous spirit that degraded all free men. Of course, this was not an appealing idea of the average, or to the average and middling men of the North, many of whom had been reared in the democratic spirit of the Jacksonian democracy that promised some basic degree of political participation and social dignity to all free white men. So that's the mainstream Republican ideology. However, the Republican Party was also home to people who did have a moral opposition to slavery itself. They were the minority, but they were there. These abolitionists could also be a motley bunch, but what united them together was their shared unwillingness to make any compromise whatsoever with the South on the question of slavery. Often these politicians and public figures had come of political age during the crises over Texas and the Mexican-American territory in the 1840s, and many of them were also influenced by the writings of abolitionists during the 1830s, with several of them being regular readers, for example, of William Lord Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator. Now, although the radical Republicans usually agreed with more moderate Republicans that the economic system of slavery was bad for progress and the fortunes of white men, They insisted that this should be an afterthought, and the immorality and ungodliness of slavery was clearly and should always be held up as the primary reason why slavery must be prevented from expanding and must eventually be done away with entirely. As one radical Republican put it is in moral aversion to slavery as a great wrong that the chief strength of the Republican Party lies. It will not do for the Republicans to confine themselves to the mere political argument, for the matter then becomes one of expediency. They must go deeper to the radical question of right and wrong." End quote. As the Republican Party became more and more established, however, the radicals were confronted with growing numbers of moderate or conservative Republicans. The wider the circle, the smaller the minority gets. And moderate and conservative Republicans were opposed, of course, to the Western expansion of slavery, but not insistent upon the eradication of slavery in the South as well. To respond to this, the radical Republicans would make intense, religiously colored speeches in the halls of Congress, reminding their audience of the extreme sin of slavery and calling everyone to reject the horror of such inhumanity. They relayed accounts of the cruelty of slavery and warned Americans not to turn away from the fundamental question of slavery, which was the sin of slavery. Often these speeches would be extremely controversial, and even other Republicans would accuse them of being inflammatory agitators. This was a role, however, that the radical Republicans eagerly embraced. For their loyalty was not to the party, the Republican Party. Indeed, many of them had abandoned the Whig Party when they failed to push it toward a clear anti-slavery position. Rather, their loyalty was to speaking the truth about the sin of slavery, regardless of whether or not it bothered much of the American public. Quote, "I glory in the name of agitator," said one radical Republican. "I wish the country could be agitated vastly more than it is." "Agitation," said another Republican, a different one, "is the great and mighty instrument for carrying forward reforms. Agitation is necessary to purify the political atmosphere." End quote. So radical Republicans believed, correctly, that the party system that preceded the death of the Whig Party, the second party system of the Democrats and the Whigs, had been in some degree artificial, because both parties did as much as they could to avoid the real fundamental conflict in the nation, which was this question of slavery. Therefore, they worried very little about other issues such as tariffs or economic policies, and instead they took every opportunity they could to bring up the issue of slavery again and force a recognition of the conflict that the nation ultimately had to deal with. The radical Republicans also had a plan for how to get rid of slavery once the nation was forced to recognize it for the sin that it was. Unlike abolitionists outside of political office, such as William Lloyd Garrison, who, as you have learned, decided that the political process and the political system was too contaminated for abolitionists to participate in. So there were some abolitionists, right, who would never run for office under the U.S. Constitution. But as for the ones who would and who were Republicans, they were comfortable with simply using the power of they were not comfortable with simply using the power of the federal government to declare slavery illegal. Most agreed that this was unconstitutional, and they instead argued for an approach that would lead to the end of slavery while still being constitutional. So that was their hope, to keep it constitutional. Meanwhile, William Lloyd Garrison is burning the Constitution, so you can see how much he thinks of that approach. But as for the radical Republicans, first they advocated the same thing all Republicans did, the banning of slavery in all Western territories. For, again, the belief was that slavery had to expand to survive. If it was isolated to the South, it was commonly believed that as the country grew, it would become more and more isolated, All the soil for the plantations would eventually be destroyed and would no longer be able to produce, and they would be compelled to join the rest of civilization in abandoning slavery. However, the radical Republicans did not merely rely upon the isolation of slavery to effect the end of it, but also advocated the federal government using every other constitutional power it had to make the business of slavery difficult for the South. This included making slavery illegal in Washington, D.C., on all American ships, and in any place outside the South. It also included flexing the muscle of the right of the federal government to regulate interstate commerce by making the domestic slave trade illegal over state lines, therefore ending the lucrative slave trade from the upper to the lower South. And they also advocated denying political office at the federal level or in any of the free states to anyone who was a slaveholder. Given all of these political and economic sanctions and pressures, they argued, they could force the South to give slavery up. However, some radical Republicans were willing to consider breaking away from the South in order to rid the Union of the United States with any participation in slavery. And throughout the 1840s and 1850s, as the North compromised more and more with the demands of the South, many radical Republicans would, after these failures, turn in frustration to the idea of the North breaking away from the South. Now, this was a very, very minority position. Most Americans cherished the Union with what one contemporary called an almost semi-religious attachment. So while almost all radical Republicans did not want to do something unconstitutional in order to end slavery, some were open to the idea of breaking away from the compact of the Union altogether so as to no longer be a part of the compact of slavery. For these radical Republicans, the Union of the United States was not an end in itself, but rather something that had value only insofar as it worked towards expanding freedom and creating a godly civilization. As one radical Republican implored his fellow Republicans to remember, quote, "The Union is worth nothing except so long as there is freedom in it," end quote. Now, although the radical Republicans were a minority within the party, their influence grew in the years right before the Civil War, as the tensions between North and South continued to grow. For as the nation went through repeated political crises in the 1850s over slavery, the conflicts and controversial events we have been discussing these last few weeks, it became more and more clear to many Northerners that this was a conflict that was never going to cease until finally one side became triumphant. So although the Republican Party's official position was to simply stop slavery from expanding west, rather than abolishing it where it already existed in the South, more and more voices in the years right before the Civil War started to diverge from this position and insist, as William Seward put it, that the disagreement between North and South, slave and free, was, quote, an irrepressible conflict. He went on to say, "Shall I tell you what this collision means? Those who think that it is accidental, unnecessary, the work of interested or fanatical agitators, and therefore ephemeral, mistake the case altogether. It is an irrepressible conflict between opposing and enduring forces, and it means that the United States must and will, sooner or later, become either a slave-holding nation or entirely a free labor nation." End quote. So on the eve of the Civil War, this was becoming clearer and clearer to more and more people. And then, finally, the war came. And that's what we'll talk about next time.